Across the world, hidden in forests, deserts, and quiet hillsides, there are ancient places that most people have never heard of, ruins buried beneath the earth, stone walls rising from forgotten landscapes, structures built thousands of years ago by people whose names have long disappeared from history. Some were powerful fortresses. Yet even after centuries, sometimes thousands of years, their stones are still standing. These structures are more than ruins. They are pieces of a much larger story. A story about the earliest communities that built, lived, and left their mark on the land. Places that once held thriving communities, quietly holding the memory of the past. Fortress of housesteads. Picture the edge of the world, not metaphorically, literally. In the 2nd century, if you were a Roman soldier and someone handed you orders for housesteads, you knew what that meant. You were going to the furthest corner of the greatest empire on earth. Beyond the wall, there was nothing Rome could claim, nothing Rome could control. Just open moorland, dark sky, and whatever came out of it at night. You weren't being rewarded. You were being stationed at the end of everything. And somehow, for nearly 300 years, men lived there anyway. Housestead sits on a natural ridge in Northumberland, in the north of England, where the land rises sharply and the wind never fully stops. It is one of the best preserved forts along Hadrian's Wall, that 73-mile line of Roman engineering cutting across the narrowest part of Britain, built in 122 CE to mark where the empire ended and something wilder began. From the northern wall of the fort, you can see for miles. Open moorland. No trees. No cover. Just distance and sky. The soldiers who stood here every day knew that view better than they knew anything else. They watched it in the rain. They watched it in the dark. They watched it in the brief northern summers when the light lasted almost all night and the landscape looked almost beautiful. Some of those soldiers had come from North Africa, from Syria, from the warm edges of the Mediterranean world, and they ended up here on this cold ridge as far from home as it was possible to be, while still standing on Roman ground. Think about that for a moment. The fort covers roughly 5 acres. Its shape is the standard Roman military rectangle, the same design used from Britain to the Persian border. The same layout repeated across the entire empire, so that any soldier transferred from one posting to another would immediately know where everything was. That was Rome's genius. Not just conquest, consistency. Inside housesteads, the outlines of almost every building are still readable in the ground. The headquarters building at the center where the commanding officer ran the garrison. The granaries with their raised floors designed to keep grain dry through the northern winters. The barrack blocks where ordinary soldiers lived 8 to a room. Equipment in the front, sleeping space in the back. 8 men, barely enough room to stand. Northern winter pressing through the walls, day after day, year after year. For 3 centuries. But the detail that brings housesteads closest isn't any of that. It's the latrines. In the southeastern corner of the fort, there is the best preserved Roman latrine block in Britain. A long communal room, stone seats side by side over a continuous drain flushed by rainwater from the rooftops. Soldiers sitting together every morning, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the wall opposite, complaining about the cold, about the food, about the commanding officer missing home in a way they probably never said out loud. You look at those stone seats and something shifts. Because suddenly this isn't ancient history anymore. This is just men, cold, bored, far from everything familiar, doing the most ordinary human thing there is and probably making jokes about it. That's how close the past gets, at housesteads. The soldiers here weren't all Roman by birth. Records show the garrison at various points included troops from Belgium, from the Rhineland, from the Danube frontier, men who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, ate different food. Thrown together on this Northumbrian ridge and told to hold the line. And they did. They built a bathhouse outside the walls. They set up shrines to their own gods alongside the official Roman ones. They had families. The civilian settlement that grew up around the fort held wives, children, traders, craftspeople. A whole small world clustered around the walls in the shadow of the empire's northern edge. Then, around the early 5th century, Rome let go. The administration collapsed. The legions were pulled back. The soldiers left house estates for the last time, walked away from the ridge and the view and the wind, and didn't come back. The buildings fell slowly. The roofs went first, then the upper walls. The Northumbrian weather did what it always does, patient and thorough, but the stone foundation stayed. The outline stayed. The latrine stayed. Come here on a gray afternoon when the clouds are moving fast and the wind is doing what it always does up on this ridge. Walk the perimeter. Stand at the northern wall. Look out across the moorland that the garrison watched for 300 years. Nothing has changed out there. The landscape is the same. The wind is the same. The sky pressing down low and fast is exactly the same sky those soldiers stood under every single day of their posting. And somewhere beneath your feet, in the stone of the barrack floors and the worn threshold of the headquarters building and those quiet stone latrine seats in the corner of the fort, 300 years of ordinary human life is still faintly present, still cold, still watching, still waiting for something that never quite came. Tia megaliths. There is a field in Ethiopia that nobody warned you about. No famous documentaries, no viral photos, no travel influencers standing in front of it with their arms spread wide. Just a stretch of ground in the Sado region of southern Ethiopia, where 33 standing stones rise from the earth in a cluster that stops you completely the moment you see it. Not because they are the tallest stones you have ever seen. They aren't. Not because they are the most perfectly carved. They aren't that either. But because of what is carved into them. And because of how little anyone can explain it. The Tia megaliths have been standing here since somewhere between the 10th and 15th centuries. A UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1980. One of the most significant archaeological sites in all of Africa. And most people have never heard of it. 33 stelae, as they are called. Stone slabs driven upright into the earth, some of them reaching over 2 meters tall, arranged in yasui, rows above a field of graves. The dead buried beneath them in a specific position, knees drawn up, arms folded, body curled inward like someone waiting to be born again. Someone chose that position deliberately. Someone believed it meant something. Walk toward the stones slowly. The first thing you notice is the surface, the carvings, abstract symbols etched into the face of each stone with a precision that doesn't match the era they came from. Swords, stylized human figures. A symbol that appears again and again across multiple stones. Something researchers call the plant symbol. A forked shape, branching upward, though nobody is entirely certain what it represents. Nobody is certain what any of it represents. That's the thing about Tia that stays with you. The symbols are clearly intentional, clearly meaningful, clearly part of a visual language that the people who carved them understood completely. And that language is entirely lost. You are looking at a message written in full confidence by people who assumed it would be understood. And standing here, 3 to 6 centuries later, you cannot read a single word of it. The graves beneath the stones tell part of the story. Archaeologists have excavated several burial sites at Tia and found the remains of multiple individuals, sometimes a single person, sometimes several, buried together in that same curled position. Young adults, mostly. Some showing signs of having lived physically demanding lives. Who were they? Warriors? Leaders? Sacrifices? The honest answer is that nobody knows. What is known is that someone went to enormous effort for them, quarrying these stones, transporting them, shaping them, carving those symbols with care and intention, driving them into the earth above the graves in a specific arrangement that must have carried meaning so obvious to the people doing it that they felt no need to write it down. That confidence is what haunts you. They weren't leaving a mystery, they were making a statement, and we lost the ability to read it somewhere along the way. The sword symbols are the ones that pull the eye. Long, clean, carved blades pointing downward on several of the stones. Some researchers believe they mark the graves of warriors. Others think the swords are symbolic of something else entirely. Status, transition, protection of the dead, and whatever came after. One theory suggests the number of swords on a stone indicated how many enemies the buried person had defeated in life. Another suggests they had nothing to do with warfare at all. Stand in front of a stone with 3 carved swords and try to decide which theory feels right. You can't, because your instinct is all you have here. Your gut reading of symbols carved by a culture you know almost nothing about, and your gut might be completely wrong. That's the specific discomfort of Tia. It doesn't let you feel certain about anything. The region around Tia holds more than just these 33 stones. The broader Sado area contains hundreds of stele sites, a whole landscape of standing stones and buried dead stretching across southern Ethiopia that researchers are still working to fully understand. This wasn't a single act of monument building. This was a tradition, a culture that expressed something fundamental about death and memory and the relationship between the living and the dead by driving carved stones into the earth above their graves. And that culture is gone, absorbed, transformed, silenced by time in the way that all cultures eventually are. What remains are the stones, still standing in their rows above the unnamed dead, still carrying their symbols toward the Ethiopian sky. Still absolutely certain about something that we have completely forgotten. Come here in the early morning, when the light is low and the shadows fall long across the standing stones, and the carved symbols catch the angle of it and stand out sharp against the surface. 33 stones. 33 statements made in full confidence by people who are no longer here to explain them. You walk between them slowly. You look at the swords and the figures and the branching plant symbols, and you feel the specific weight of something you cannot name. Not fear. Not wonder, exactly. Something quieter than both. The feeling of standing inside a conversation that ended before you arrived. Where the words are still on the wall. Where the meaning is still there, locked inside the stone, just out of reach, and somehow that makes it feel more human, not less. The silent stone forts of Kerry. Along the rugged western coast of Ireland, where the Atlantic wind moves slowly across rolling green hills, ancient circles of stone still sit quietly in the landscape. At first glance, they may seem like simple ruins, almost easy to overlook. But these structures have stood here for more than 1,000 years, watching the centuries pass in silence. These are the stone forts of County Kerry. From above, they appear as perfect rings carved into the earth. Thick walls made from stacked gray limestone form circular enclosures, sometimes rising several meters high. There is no cement holding them together, no modern reinforcement. Just carefully balanced stone, placed by hands that lived here more than a millennium ago. And somehow, they still stand. Some of the most impressive examples can still be visited today. Forts like Stage Fort, hidden among the Kerry Mountains, or Cahergal Stone Fort, overlooking the surrounding fields. Their walls are astonishingly thick, sometimes reaching 4 meters in height and several meters in width. Standing beside them today, it becomes immediately clear that these were not casual constructions. They were built with planning, effort, and remarkable skill. Archaeologists generally believe these stone forts were built between 500 and 1000 AD, during the early medieval period of Irish history. At that time, much of rural Ireland was organized around small farming communities. Families lived close to the land, raising cattle, growing crops, and surviving in a landscape that could be both beautiful and unforgiving. The forts likely served as protected homesteads. Inside the circular walls, wooden houses would have once stood, roofs made from thatch, supported by timber beams. Fires burning slowly inside, filling the air with the smell of peat smoke. Life here would have been simple, but demanding. The thick stone walls served several purposes. They protected livestock from thieves and predators. They offered safety during small raids, which were common in early medieval Ireland. And perhaps most importantly, they marked territory, a visible statement that this land belonged to someone. But the design of some of these forts raises interesting questions, because many of them appear stronger than what a simple farming family would need. The walls are unusually thick. Entrances are narrow and carefully positioned, forcing visitors to approach in controlled ways, almost like miniature fortresses. Some forts even contain hidden stairways built inside the walls themselves, allowing defenders to climb to higher positions. Whoever designed these structures clearly understood both engineering and defense, and yet, despite all this effort, the people who built them left behind very little record of their lives. There are no written accounts describing the construction of the Kerry stone forts, no surviving names of the builders, no detailed explanation of their purpose, only stone. Circle after circle of carefully placed stone. Over time, these ancient structures slowly became woven into local folklore. In Irish tradition, many stone forts were believed to be connected to the Sidhe, the mysterious fairy folk of Celtic mythology. The forts were sometimes called fairy forts, places where supernatural beings were said to dwell. Even today, many locals treat these sites with quiet respect. Farmers sometimes avoid disturbing them. Roads are occasionally built around them rather than through them. Stories still circulate of strange misfortune, following those who attempt to dismantle the old stone rings. Whether those stories are superstition or cultural memory is impossible to say. But what is certain is this: the stone forts of Kerry have endured for centuries. Storms from the Atlantic have battered their walls. Generations of people have lived, farmed, and disappeared around them. Entire chapters of Irish history have come and gone, and still the forts remain, silent circles in the grass. No written history. No clear explanation. Only the quiet presence of ancient stone, standing patiently in the hills of Western Ireland, waiting for someone to fully understand the world that built them. Prehistoric Fortress, perched high in the Rhodope Mountains of southern Bulgaria, lies one of the most mysterious ancient fortresses in Europe, a vast stone complex known today as Prehistoric. At first glance, the hill looks almost natural, just a strange cluster of weathered rocks rising above the surrounding valleys. But as you walk closer, the shapes begin to change. Lines appear where nature rarely makes them. Steps carved directly into the stone begin leading upward, and slowly it becomes clear. This mountain was not simply shaped by time, it was carved by human hands. For thousands of years. Prehistoric is not just a fortress. It is an entire ancient city built into solid rock, a place where civilizations rose and fell, while the mountain quietly remained. Archaeologists believe human activity here may date back nearly 7,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously used sacred sites in Europe. Long before medieval kings built castles across the continent, people were already gathering on this hill. Most historians believe the earliest builders were the Thracians, an ancient culture that once dominated much of the Balkan Peninsula. The Thracians were known as skilled warriors, but they were also deeply spiritual people. They believed certain places in nature held powerful connections to the divine. Mountains were among the most sacred, and this hill may have been one of their most important sanctuaries. The earliest structures discovered at Prehistoric suggest that the site began not as a fortress, but as a religious center. Large sections of rock were carefully carved to create open ceremonial spaces. At the center of the complex stands a massive stone altar, blackened from centuries of fire. Here, priests may have performed rituals beneath the open sky, offering sacrifices while smoke drifted slowly into the mountain air. Ancient historians once wrote about a powerful sanctuary of the god Dionysus, located somewhere in these mountains. According to those accounts, rulers traveled great distances to hear prophecies from the temple's priests. Some legends even claim that Alexander the Great himself visited the sanctuary before beginning his legendary conquest across Asia. Whether that famous temple once stood here remains uncertain, but the scale of Prehistoric suggests this mountain held enormous importance. Over time, the sanctuary began to grow. New chambers were carved deeper into the rock. Stone corridors connected different levels of the hill. Large halls appeared where rituals may have been performed, while smaller rooms likely served as living spaces for priests and residents. Slowly, the sacred sanctuary transformed into a city carved almost entirely from stone. At the highest point of the hill stands the Acropolis, the most protected area of the complex. From here, the view stretches across miles of mountain valleys, a strategic position that would have allowed ancient inhabitants to see approaching travelers long before they reach the fortress. Control the hill, and you control the surrounding land. Because of this, Preparicon eventually became far more than a religious site. It became a fortress. When the Roman Empire expanded into the region, the city was strengthened with new defensive walls and fortifications. Roman engineers improved the roads and added water storage systems to support a growing population. The once sacred sanctuary was now a thriving settlement. Soldiers guarded the gates. Merchants passed through the stone streets. Families built homes within the carved chambers of the mountain. For centuries, life continued here. Later, during the Byzantine period, Preparicon became an important stronghold protecting the mountain routes of the Balkans. New towers were built along the cliffs, and thick defensive walls surrounded the upper sections of the fortress. The mountain itself served as a natural defense, steep slopes, narrow paths, and towering stone walls watching over the valleys below. But history is rarely kind to even the strongest fortresses. As new powers rose across the region and trade routes began to shift, the importance of Preparicon slowly faded. By the late medieval period, the fortress was gradually abandoned. Its streets fell silent. Wind moved through empty chambers carved into the rock, and rain slowly washed across the ancient stairways. For centuries, the mountain stood largely forgotten. Local villagers knew of the ruins, but few realized how ancient the site truly was. Only in recent decades did archaeologists begin to uncover the full scale of what had once existed here. And what they discovered was remarkable. Hidden beneath layers of soil and vegetation were the remains of a vast ancient complex, including ceremonial halls, defensive towers, gates, and entire neighborhoods carved into the mountain. Even today, researchers believe much of Preparicon still remains buried beneath the rock, unknown chambers, hidden corridors, perhaps even older structures waiting to be uncovered. Standing at the summit now, surrounded by the silent stone ruins, it is difficult not to imagine the thousands of lives that once passed through this place. Priests lighting sacred fires, Roman soldiers watching the mountain passes, families living within the carved stone walls, all part of a story that lasted thousands of years. And yet, despite everything that has been discovered, Preparicon still holds many secrets, a city carved into the mountain, ancient, silent, and only partially understood. The Valeron Caves. On the northern side of Gran Canaria, high above a deep volcanic ravine, there is a cliff that hides something unusual. At first it looks like nothing more than a rough wall of rock, carved by time and wind. But as you move closer, shapes begin to appear. Small openings. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. And suddenly the cliff no longer looks natural. It looks organized. Almost like a honeycomb carved into the mountain. This place is known as the Valeron Caves, one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in the Canary Islands. From a distance, the caves look almost impossible to reach. The cliff rises steeply above the valley below, protecting the chambers from storms and from anyone approaching too easily. But once inside, the true scale of the site becomes clear. More than 300 chambers have been carved into the volcanic rock. Some are small, some slightly larger. Each one carefully shaped by hand, each one placed beside the next in long rows across the cliff face. It almost feels like walking through a giant stone archive, but these chambers were not homes, and they were not tombs. They served a different purpose, a very practical one. Long before Spanish explorers arrived in the Canary Islands, Gran Canaria was home to an indigenous culture known today as the Canaric. These early inhabitants lived on the island for centuries, developing their own systems of farming, religion, and survival. Life on a volcanic island was not always easy. Rainfall could be unpredictable. Droughts could last for long periods. Food security was never guaranteed. So the Canary developed a clever solution. They built enormous communal granaries carved into the mountains themselves. The Valeron Caves were one of the largest of these storage complexes. Inside each chamber, grains such as barley and wheat could be stored safely for long periods of time, protected from moisture, protected from animals, protected theft. The location high on the cliff made it difficult for enemies to reach the stored food. Only narrow paths led up to the caves, and those paths could easily be guarded. In a world where food meant survival, this was an intelligent design. The caves were likely used by multiple communities across the region. Each chamber may have belonged to a different family or clan. Some archaeologists believe wooden doors once sealed the openings, while clay seals or markings may have identified the owners of each chamber. Over time, the storage complex grew larger. New chambers were carved, new sections added, and eventually the cliff became filled with hundreds of these small storage spaces. An entire food reserve hidden within the mountain. But the story of the Valeron Caves did not end with the Canary. In the late 15th century, Spanish forces arrived in the Canary Islands during the expansion of the Spanish crown. The conquest of Gran Canaria was long and violent. Indigenous communities fought fiercely to defend their land, but eventually the island fell under Spanish control. Many indigenous traditions slowly disappeared in the centuries that followed. Villages changed, languages faded, cultures were reshaped. Yet the caves remained, high on the cliff, watching quietly over the valley. For centuries, travelers passing through the region noticed the strange openings in the rock but did not fully understand their purpose. Some early explorers believed the caves might have been homes. Others thought they could have been burial chambers. It was only through careful archaeological study that researchers finally understood what they truly were: a massive communal granary, one of the largest known in the Canary Islands. Today, the Valeron Caves are recognized as an important cultural monument. Visitors can climb the paths leading toward the cliff and see the honeycomb-like chambers carved into the stone. Standing there, it becomes easier to imagine the ancient island communities who once depended on this place. Farmers carrying sacks of grain up the narrow path. Families carefully sealing their storage chambers. Guards watching the valley below. Life here was organized around survival. And these caves were part of that system. A quiet but essential part. The cliffs of Gran Canaria have witnessed centuries of change. Empires arrived, cultures shifted. Entire ways of life disappeared. But the Valeron Caves remain carved into the volcanic stone. Hundreds of small chambers, patiently holding the memory of a society that once thrived on this island. Silent openings in the rock. Still watching the valley. Still telling the story of the people who built them. Castello di Cucuruzzu. Hidden deep within the forests of southern Corsica, surrounded by granite mountains and quiet valleys, there is an ancient stone fortress known as Castello di Cucuruzzu. Today it rests quietly beneath the trees, almost blending into the natural landscape. But thousands of years ago, this hilltop was once a place of protection, community, and survival. At first, the structure can be difficult to notice. Large granite boulders sit scattered across the hill, shaped by centuries of wind and rain. But as you walk closer, the pattern becomes clear. The stones are not random. They form walls, corridors, and defensive barriers carefully arranged by human hands. This was a fortress and a home. Castello di Cucuruzzu was built during the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago, when early communities across the Mediterranean were learning how to build fortified settlements to protect themselves from rival groups. Corsica may seem isolated today, but during ancient times, the island was part of a much wider world of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The builders of Cucuruzzu understood their landscape well. The fortress sits on a small hill surrounded by forest. giving its inhabitants a clear view of the surrounding valleys, while also keeping the settlement hidden from distant observers. The structure itself is built from massive blocks of granite gathered from the nearby hills. These stones were stacked carefully without mortar, forming thick protective walls that have survived for thousands of years. At the center of the site stands a circular tower, the heart of the fortress. From this elevated position, the inhabitants could watch the approaches to their settlement and detect movement in the valleys below. Control the hill, and you control the land around it. Around the tower, narrow passageways and stone walls form a defensive maze. Anyone attempting to enter the settlement would have been forced to move slowly through tight corridors, giving the defenders a strong advantage. But Kukurutsu was not only a military structure, it was also a place where people lived their daily lives. Families likely built small houses within the protective walls using wood, stone, and thatch. Fires would have burned inside these homes while food was prepared and tools were crafted. Children grew up within these walls. Farmers worked the nearby land. Shepherds moved their animals through the valleys. The fortress was both shelter and community. Archaeologists exploring the site have discovered fragments of pottery, tools, and other everyday objects that help reveal how these early Corsican societies functioned. These discoveries show that the people living here were skilled builders who understood both their environment and the need for cooperation within a small community. Castello di Cucuruzzu is also part of a larger prehistoric network of stone structures found across Corsica and neighboring Sardinia. During the Bronze Age, communities across these islands built fortified settlements using similar techniques, suggesting shared ideas and cultural connections across the Mediterranean. Over time, however, the settlement was eventually abandoned. The reasons remain uncertain. Changes in climate, shifting trade routes, or conflicts between groups may have forced the inhabitants to move elsewhere. When the people left, nature slowly reclaimed the fortress. Trees grew around the walls. Soil settled between the stones. For centuries, the ruins remained hidden beneath the forest, known mainly to local shepherds and travelers passing through the mountains. Only in modern times did archaeologists begin studying the site in detail, revealing the structure's importance in understanding Corsica's ancient past. Today, visitors can walk through the quiet stone corridors and stand inside the ancient tower, surrounded by the same mountains and forests that once protected the settlement. The wind moves gently through the trees, and the stones remain, silent witnesses to a community that lived here more than 3,000 years ago, leaving behind only the fortress they built high above the valleys of Corsica. The massive stone ramparts of Tel Dan. At the northern edge of modern-day Israel, near the base of Mount Hermon, lies an ancient mound of earth and stone known as Tel Dan. From a distance, it appears to be just another quiet hill rising above the surrounding landscape. Trees grow along its slopes, birds move across the sky, and a peaceful river flows nearby. But beneath that calm surface lies the remains of one of the oldest fortified cities in the region. Layer after layer of history is buried inside this mound. Civilizations built here abandoned the site, and then new communities returned to build again. Over thousands of years, the ruins slowly formed a rising hill, what archaeologists call a tell. And within that mound lies a remarkable defensive structure. Massive stone ramparts built more than 3,000 years ago. Structures so large that even today their scale still surprises researchers. The ancient city of Dan once stood at a very important location. The fertile land surrounding the site was rich with water from the nearby springs that feed the Jordan River. In a region where water could determine survival, this alone made the area valuable. But the city's position also placed it along important trade routes connecting the Mediterranean coast with inland regions of Syria and Mesopotamia. Caravans passed through these valleys. Merchants traveled these roads. Armies moved across the landscape, and any city controlling this region needed to be prepared to defend itself. That is where the massive ramparts of Tel Dan come in. Archaeological excavations have revealed that during the Middle Bronze Age, around the 18th century BCE, the inhabitants of the city began constructing an enormous defensive system around their settlement. the builders first created a steep earthen slope around the outer edge of the city. This artificial hill formed a protective barrier that attackers would struggle to climb, but the earth alone was not enough. The surface of the rampart was reinforced with carefully placed stones, forming a thick outer layer designed to stabilize the slope and make it even more difficult to breach. Together, the earth and stone formed a defensive wall that stretched around the city like a protective ring. From the outside, the rampart would have appeared as a towering embankment rising above the surrounding land. Anyone approaching the city would immediately see its strength. The design was not only about height, but also about structure. The sloping sides of the rampart absorbed the impact of attacks more effectively than vertical walls. If enemies attempted to dig or batter the defenses, the earth-filled structure could resist damage better than many traditional stone walls. It was an early form of large-scale defensive engineering, and it worked. The ramparts protected the city for centuries. Within those walls, life continued to grow and develop. Houses were built along narrow streets. Markets formed where merchants traded goods, and temples were constructed where religious ceremonies were performed. The people living here were part of a dynamic and constantly changing world. Empires rose and fell across the ancient Near East. Egyptian rulers extended their influence into Canaan. Later, the region saw the rise of powerful kingdoms such as Aram and Israel. Through these centuries of political change, the city of Dan remained strategically important. Its location near the northern border of ancient Israel eventually gave rise to the biblical phrase, "From Dan to Beersheba," a way of describing the entire span of the Israelite kingdom from north to south. But the city's history stretches even further back than those biblical references. One of the most fascinating discoveries at Tel Dan came in the 1990s, when archaeologists uncovered fragments of an ancient stone inscription now known as the Tel Dan Stele. The inscription appears to have been written by an Aramean king celebrating a military victory over the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. What makes the discovery particularly important is that the text includes what many scholars believe to be the earliest known historical reference to the House of David, a possible mention of the royal dynasty associated with the biblical King David. Although debates continue among historians, the discovery highlights the historical importance of the city and its role in the political struggles of the ancient Near East. Yet even before those events, the massive ramparts already stood as the city's most impressive feature. The scale of the construction suggests a large and organized workforce. Moving such enormous amounts of earth and stone would have required careful planning, coordination, and leadership. It was not the work of a small village. It was the work of a city determined to protect itself. Another remarkable feature discovered at Tel Dan is an ancient mud brick gateway, dating back to the same Bronze Age period. This structure, often called the Abraham Gate, consists of a large arched entrance built using mud bricks rather than stone. What makes the gate particularly fascinating is the design of its arch, which demonstrates that builders in the region understood advanced construction techniques far earlier than many historians once believed. For centuries, the gate remained buried beneath layers of soil preserved by the earth that covered it. Today, archaeologists have carefully exposed the structure while leaving parts protected to prevent damage from weather and time. Walking through the ruins of Tel Dan today, visitors can still see the remains of the ancient ramparts stretching across the landscape. The slopes are covered with grass and trees now, but the shape of the defenses remains clear. It is easy to imagine what the city once looked like. Guards standing at the gates. Watchmen scanning the horizon. Caravans approaching from distant lands. Inside the walls, daily life unfolded much as it did in cities across the ancient world. People worked, traded, worshipped, and raised families within the protection of the massive ramparts. The defenses that once stood as barriers against invading armies eventually became part of the archaeological record. Centuries passed, empires changed, and eventually the city itself faded into history. Yet, the ramparts remain. Silent earth and stone rising from the northern valleys of Israel. marking the place where an ancient city once stood strong against the uncertainties of the ancient world. Even today, thousands of years later, the massive stone ramparts of Tel Dan still tell the story of a civilization that understood the importance of protection, planning, and the power of building something meant to endure. The stone structures of Kirikitiya. On the southern coast of Cyprus, not far from the quiet flow of the Moroni River, there stands an ancient settlement known as Kirikitiya. At first glance, the site appears simple, a series of low stone walls scattered across a hillside. But beneath that simplicity lies one of the most remarkable prehistoric villages ever discovered in the Mediterranean. Kirikitiya dates back more than 9,000 years, placing it deep within the Neolithic period, a time when human societies were beginning to transition from nomadic, hunting lifestyles to permanent settlements built around agriculture and community life. Long before written language, long before cities and kingdoms, people were already building organized villages here. The settlement sits on a gentle slope overlooking the river valley, a location that offered both fresh water and fertile land for farming. Early inhabitants would have cultivated crops such as wheat and barley while raising animals like sheep and goats, forming one of the earliest agricultural communities on the island of Cyprus. But what makes Kirikitiya truly fascinating is the design of its buildings. Unlike the rectangular houses common in many later settlements, the structures here were circular. Each home was built from carefully stacked limestone blocks, gathered from the surrounding landscape. The walls were thick and sturdy, forming round enclosures that provided both shelter and protection. Inside these circular homes, daily life unfolded in a compact and organized space. The floors were often made from packed earth or plastered surfaces. In some houses, small hearths were discovered, suggesting places where food was cooked and families gathered around the warmth of fire. Other structures appeared to have been used for storage, holding supplies of grain and tools needed for daily survival. The circular design of the homes may have served several practical purposes. Round structures are naturally stable and distribute weight evenly along the walls, making them resistant to collapse. They also create a comfortable interior space where movement flows easily around the center of the room. But there may also have been cultural reasons for this design. Many early communities favored circular architecture because it reflected the idea of unity within the household, a shared living space where families gathered together rather than separating into distinct rooms. Walking through the reconstructed sections of Kirikitiya today, it becomes easier to imagine the rhythm of life inside this ancient village. Smoke rising slowly from hearth fires, children moving between houses along narrow paths, farmers returning from nearby fields with baskets of grain. Although the village may seem small by modern standards, it was carefully organized. Houses were clustered closely together, forming compact neighborhoods connected by winding pathways that followed the natural slope of the hillside. Stone retaining walls helped stabilize the settlement and prevent erosion from seasonal rains. Perhaps the most intriguing feature of Kirikitiya is the presence of a protective wall surrounding part of the settlement. Archaeologists discovered that the inhabitants had built a substantial defensive barrier along the outer edge of the village, possibly to protect against wild animals or rival groups. Even in this early stage of human history, communities understood the importance of security. Life here was cooperative. Farming, construction, and daily survival required shared effort among the villagers. Evidence suggests that people lived in extended family groups, with knowledge and traditions passed down through generations. One particularly unusual discovery at Kirikitiya involves burial practices. Many inhabitants were buried beneath the floors of their own homes. Archaeologists found human remains carefully placed under house foundations, sometimes accompanied by simple offerings. This practice suggests a strong connection between the living and the dead. By burying family members beneath the home, the community may have believed that ancestors continued to remain part of the household, their presence literally supporting the home above. Over time, the settlement continued to grow and evolve. New houses were built. Older structures were repaired or replaced. the village adapted to the changing needs of its inhabitants, maintaining its circular architectural style across generations. Yet eventually, for reasons that remain unclear, the settlement was abandoned. Perhaps environmental changes affected farming. Perhaps the population moved to other parts of the island. Whatever the reason, the stone structures of Kirokatia were left behind. For thousands of years, the village slowly faded into the landscape. Wind and rain softened the edges of the stone walls. Soil covered the floors of the ancient houses. Plants grew between the stones. Yet the basic layout of the settlement remained surprisingly well preserved. Modern archaeological excavations beginning in the 20th century revealed just how significant the site truly was. Researchers carefully uncovered the circular buildings and studied the remains of tools, pottery, and everyday objects left behind by the ancient inhabitants. These discoveries helped historians better understand how early agricultural communities lived, worked, and organized themselves. Today, Kirokatia is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, valued not only for its age but also for the insight it provides into one of humanity's earliest experiments with permanent village life. Visitors walking through the site can see both the original ruins and reconstructed versions of the circular houses, giving a glimpse into what the settlement may have looked like nearly 9,000 years ago. Standing among the stone walls, it is difficult not to imagine the countless generations that once lived here. Farmers tending their crops, families gathering around hearth fires, children growing up within the protective walls of the village. All of them part of a story that began long before recorded history. And although the people of Kirokitia eventually disappeared from the site, the structures they built continue to speak across the centuries. Simple circles of stone, quiet reminders of one of humanity's earliest communities, preserved on a hillside overlooking the river valley of Cyprus. The proto-phase of Sisupalgar, in the eastern plains of India, not far from the modern city of Bhubaneswar, there lies a large archaeological mound that once held one of the most remarkable ancient cities of the subcontinent. Today the area appears calm and ordinary, fields, scattered trees, and fragments of old earthworks rising gently from the ground. But beneath the soil rests the remains of Sisupalgar, a fortified settlement that flourished more than 2,000 years ago. To understand how this city emerged, archaeologists often look even further back in time, to what researchers call the proto-phase of Sisupalgar, the earliest stage of settlement that existed before the fully developed city was built. This early phase reveals the beginning of a transformation, a small settlement slowly becoming an organized urban center. Long before the great fortification walls appeared, people were already living in this area. The land around Sisupalgar was fertile, supported by rivers and seasonal rainfall that made agriculture possible for early communities. Farmers cultivated rice and other crops across the surrounding plains. Villages grew gradually. Trade routes began forming across eastern India, connecting inland communities with coastal regions along the Bay of Bengal. These early networks likely brought new goods, ideas, and cultural influences into the region. During this proto-phase, the settlement at Sisupalgar was still relatively modest. Houses were built using simple materials such as mud, timber, and thatch. The layout of the village was not yet organized into the structured urban grid that would later appear. Instead, buildings were scattered in small clusters. Paths formed naturally between them as people moved through the settlement during daily life. Archaeological excavations have revealed layers of pottery fragments, tools, and other everyday objects belonging to this early phase of occupation. These artifacts provide valuable clues about the people who lived here. Pottery styles found at Sisupalgar show connections with other cultures across eastern India, suggesting that the settlement was already part of a broader exchange network. Even before the city walls were constructed, Sisupalgar was not isolated. It was participating in a growing regional system of trade and communication. One of the most important developments during this proto-phase was the gradual increase in population. As more people settled in the area, the need for organization and protection became more important. communities began to think about space differently. Paths became more defined. Areas for storage, cooking, and craft work started to appear. The settlement slowly moved toward greater structure. At the same time, early defensive ideas may have started to take shape. While the massive fortification walls that Sisupalgar is famous for had not yet been built, archaeologists believe that natural terrain and smaller protective boundaries may have been used during this stage. Rivers and marshy ground could help limit access from certain directions. Raised areas of land offered better visibility across the surrounding plains. Early settlers likely chose the location carefully for these advantages. Over time, the proto-phase settlement laid the foundation for what would later become one of the most impressive fortified cities in ancient India. By around the 3rd century BCE, the settlement underwent a major transformation. Large defensive ramparts were constructed, forming a nearly square enclosure around the city. Each side of the fortified area measured roughly 1 kilometer in length, creating a vast protected urban space. The walls themselves were built from earth reinforced with laterite stone, forming thick ramparts capable of resisting attack and controlling entry into the city. But these massive walls did not appear suddenly. They were the result of centuries of gradual growth that began during the proto-phase. Without those earlier generations of settlers building communities, establishing trade, and developing local knowledge of the land, the later city of Sisupalgar may never have existed. Inside the fortified city that eventually emerged, streets were organized in a grid-like pattern. Archaeologists have identified evidence of gateways, residential areas, craft production zones, and possibly administrative spaces. The city appears to have been carefully planned, but its roots remain in the earlier village that occupied the same land. The proto-phase tells the story of those first inhabitants, the people who lived before the walls were built. They were farmers, potters, traders, and families shaping their environment through daily life. Their homes may not have been monumental structures. Their settlement may not yet have looked like a city. Yet their presence created the conditions that allowed urban life to emerge. When archaeologists examine the layers of soil at Sisupalgar, they read history almost like pages in a book. Each layer represents a different moment in time. The deeper layers belong to the proto-phase, the earliest chapter of the story. Above them come the layers of the fortified city, and above those, the traces of later periods when the city declined and the land returned to quieter use. Standing at the site today, it can be difficult to imagine that this peaceful landscape once held a thriving urban center surrounded by strong defensive walls. Yet the evidence beneath the ground tells that story clearly. Sisupalgar did not begin as a city. It began as a settlement, a community slowly growing on the plains of eastern India. Over generations, that small beginning developed into something far larger, a fortified urban center that played an important role in the region's history. And at the heart of that transformation lies the proto-phase of Sisupalgar, a quiet beginning, the first step in the long story of an ancient city. The inner compounds of Chan Chan, along the dry northern coast of Peru, where the desert stretches toward the Pacific Ocean and the wind moves quietly across endless sand, the ruins of a vast ancient city rise from the landscape. Today the structures appear soft and weathered, their walls shaped by centuries of erosion. But once this place was the heart of a powerful civilization. This city is known as Chanchan. For hundreds of years it served as the capital of the Chimu Kingdom, one of the most influential societies in pre-Columbian South America. At its height, Chanchan was the largest adobe city ever built in the Americas, covering more than 20 square kilometers of desert terrain. From above, the city reveals a carefully organized layout. Large rectangular sections divide the urban space into separate districts, each surrounded by high adobe walls. Within these walls lie the most intriguing features of Chanchan's architecture, the inner compounds. These compounds were not simple neighborhoods or ordinary residential areas. They were monumental complexes that served as centers of administration, storage, ritual activity, and elite residents. Each compound functioned almost like a small city within the larger city. Massive adobe walls enclosed these spaces, sometimes reaching heights of nearly 10 meters. The walls were thick and imposing, creating a sense of separation between the inside world of the compound and the busy life of the city outside. Entry into these compounds was tightly controlled. Most had only a single main entrance, forcing visitors to pass through narrow corridors before reaching the interior courtyards. This design allowed guards and administrators to regulate who could enter and who could not. Once inside, the scale of the compound becomes clearer. Wide open courtyards stretch across the complex, surrounded by long corridors and carefully arranged rooms. These spaces were likely used for gatherings, ceremonies, and official activities connected to the ruling elite of the Chimu state. But perhaps the most fascinating elements inside the compounds are the storage rooms. Hundreds of small chambers line the interior sections of many compounds. Archaeologists believe these rooms were used to store valuable goods, collected through tribute from across the Chimu kingdom. Textiles, ceramics, food supplies, and precious materials may all have been kept here. The Chimu state controlled a vast territory along the northern coast of Peru, and goods from distant valleys were brought to Chan Chan as part of the kingdom's administrative system. The inner compounds acted as secure centers where these resources could be organized and redistributed. This system allowed the Chimu rulers to maintain control over their expanding territory. Resources flowed into the compounds. Authority flowed outward. The architecture itself reflects this powerful centralized structure. The walls surrounding the compounds were not only defensive barriers, but also symbols of political power. Their size and complexity demonstrated the authority of the rulers who governed the city. Inside many compounds, archaeologists have also discovered elaborate decorative designs carved into the adobe walls. Patterns of fish, waves, and geometric shapes appear repeatedly across the surfaces. These designs were not random. They reflected the importance of the ocean in Chimu culture. The coastal waters provided fish, shellfish, and other marine resources that supported much of the region's population. By incorporating ocean imagery into the architecture, the Chimu may have been symbolically connecting their city to the natural forces that sustained their civilization. Another important feature inside some compounds is the presence of audiencias, small U-shaped structures that may have served as administrative offices or meeting spaces. Officials could have used these rooms to oversee the flow of goods entering the compound and manage the distribution of resources. These administrative spaces reveal how organized the Chimu government had become. Chan Chan was not simply a settlement where people lived. It was the political and economic center of an entire kingdom. The inner compounds played a central role in maintaining that system. Each compound is believed to have been associated with a Chimhu ruler. When a king died, his compound may have been sealed and preserved as a kind of royal estate, while a new compound was constructed for the next ruler. Over time, this process created a series of monumental compounds across the city, each representing a different period of leadership. This practice meant that Chan Chan continued to expand as new rulers built their own administrative centers, rather than reusing those of their predecessors. The result was a city composed of multiple powerful compounds standing side by side across the desert. For centuries, this system worked. The Chimu kingdom grew wealthy and influential, controlling trade routes, agricultural systems, and coastal resources along a large stretch of the Peruvian coast. But eventually a new power emerged from the highlands of South America, the Inca Empire. During the late 15th century, Inca forces expanded northward and confronted the Chimu state. After a period of conflict, the Chimu kingdom was defeated and absorbed into the growing Inca Empire. Chan Chan remained an important city for a time, but its political independence had ended. The elaborate administrative system that had once operated inside the inner compounds slowly lost its purpose. Over the centuries that followed, the desert winds began to reshape the adobe walls. Without constant maintenance, the structures gradually eroded under the harsh coastal climate. Yet even in their weathered condition, the compounds still reveal the remarkable complexity of Chimu architecture. Walking through the ruins today, visitors can still see the high walls forming vast enclosed spaces across the desert floor. Corridors lead into courtyards, storage rooms line the edges of long passages, and decorative patterns remain visible on many of the surviving surfaces. The silence of the desert surrounds the ruins, but the scale of the city is still clear. Chan Chan was once a place of enormous activity and authority. At the center of that system were the inner compounds, secure spaces where resources were stored, decisions were made, and the power of the Chimu rulers was displayed through monumental architecture. Today, these adobe walls continue to stand against the desert wind, preserving the memory of a city that once governed an entire coastal civilization. The terraces of Takalik Abaj. On the lush Pacific slopes of southern Guatemala, where dense tropical forests meet volcanic hills and rivers cut slowly through the landscape, lies the ancient archaeological site known as Takalik Abaj. Today the area is quiet and green, filled with the sounds of insects and birds moving through the trees. But long before the forest grew over the ruins, this place was once one of the most important cultural centers in Mesoamerica. Takalik Abaj developed over many centuries, beginning as an early settlement during the pre-classic period, long before the rise of the great Maya cities that later dominated the region. What makes this site especially remarkable is the way its builders transformed the natural hillside into a carefully organized ceremonial and administrative center. They did this by building massive terraces. Instead of constructing their city on flat ground, the inhabitants of Takalik Abaj reshaped the slopes of the hillside itself. Huge sections of earth were cut and leveled to create wide stone-supported platforms that stepped gradually down the landscape. From a distance, these terraces appear like giant staircases carved into the mountain. Each level created new space for buildings, plazas, and ceremonial structures. The terraces allowed the community to expand across terrain that would otherwise have been too steep for construction. But these platforms were not simply practical solutions to a difficult landscape. They were also expressions of power and organization. Constructing such large terraces required enormous labor. Workers would have needed to move huge amounts of soil and stone while reinforcing the edges of each platform with carefully placed retaining walls. This kind of project could only succeed with strong leadership and coordinated effort across the community. The result was a city that rose step by step across the hillside. At the upper levels of Takalik Abaj stood ceremonial plazas where important gatherings likely took place. Stone monuments and sculptures were placed within these spaces, marking them as locations of ritual and authority. Some of these monuments reveal another fascinating aspect of the site. Takalik Abaj sits at a cultural crossroads between two major civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica, the Olmec and the Maya. Early sculptures discovered at the site show strong Olmec artistic influence, including carved figures and symbolic designs that resemble those found in Olmec's centers along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Later monuments, however, begin to display clear Maya characteristics. This shift suggests that Takalik Abaj played an important role during a transitional period in Mesoamerican history, when cultural ideas and artistic traditions were spreading between different regions. The terraces themselves may have helped organize this evolving society. Different levels of the site appear to have served different functions. Some terraces held ceremonial plazas and monuments connected to religious practices. Others supported residential areas where members of the community lived and worked. Agricultural terraces may also have existed in the surrounding landscape, allowing farmers to cultivate crops on the steep volcanic slopes. Water management was another important consideration. The region receives heavy rainfall during certain parts of the year, and without careful planning, the terraces could easily have eroded or collapsed. The builders likely designed drainage systems that guided rainwater safely down the hillside, protecting the platforms from damage. This attention to environmental conditions shows how deeply the inhabitants understood their landscape. Takalika continued to grow for centuries. New terraces were added, existing platforms were expanded. Stone sculptures and monuments marked the achievements of rulers and recorded important events within the community. Over time, the settlement became one of the most influential centers along the Pacific coast of Guatemala. Trade routes passed through the region, bringing goods such as obsidian, jade, and cacao from distant areas of Mesoamerica. These exchanges connected Takalika to a much larger network of cultural and economic activity. Yet, despite its importance, the site eventually began to decline. The reasons are not entirely clear. Like many ancient cities, Takalika likely experienced changes in trade networks, political alliances, and environmental conditions that slowly altered the balance of life in the region. As populations shifted and new centers rose elsewhere, the terraces of Takalika were gradually abandoned. Without constant maintenance, vegetation slowly began reclaiming the platforms. Trees grew between the stone retaining walls, and layers of soil and leaves covered many of the ancient structures. For centuries, the ruins remained hidden beneath the forest. Only in modern times did archaeologists begin carefully studying the site and uncovering its remarkable terraces once again. Excavations revealed the scale of the construction and the long history of cultural change preserved within the site's architecture and monuments. Today, Takalika is recognized as one of the key archaeological locations for understanding the early development of complex societies in Mesoamerica. Visitors walking along the restored paths can still see the terraces stepping across the hillside, forming wide platforms surrounded by dense green vegetation. Standing on one of these terraces, it becomes easier to imagine the ancient city that once stood here. Ceremonies unfolding in the plazas, stone monuments rising above the platforms, people moving between levels of the hillside along carefully constructed paths. The terraces of Takalika represent far more than simple construction. They are evidence of a community that learned how to shape its environment on a large scale, turning a steep hillside into a thriving center of culture, trade, and ceremony. Even today, thousands of years after the first terraces were built, the landscape still carries the marks of that remarkable transformation. The cliff dwellings of the Bandiagara Escarpment. In the heart of Mali, across the dry lands of West Africa, a long wall of sandstone rises dramatically from the surrounding plains. This immense natural formation stretches for nearly 150 kilometers, forming a towering cliff known as the Bandiagara Escarpment. From a distance, the cliffs appear almost like a fortress built by nature itself, standing high above the villages and fields below. But when you look closer, something unusual appears along the face of the rock. Small structures, clusters of mud brick buildings clinging to the cliff walls. Some of them placed so high above the ground that reaching them seems almost impossible. These are the cliff dwellings of the Bandiagara Escarpment, one of the most extraordinary architectural landscapes in Africa. For centuries, the cliffs have been home to the Dogon people, a community known for its unique traditions, art, and spiritual beliefs. Their villages sit along the base of the escarpment and across the plateau above, forming a chain of settlements that follow the long line of sandstone cliffs. Yet the structures embedded high within the rock face are older than the Dogon themselves. Before the Dogon arrived in this region, another culture had already built homes within the cliffs. These earlier inhabitants are believed to have been the Telem, a mysterious group whose history survives mostly through archaeological remains and oral traditions passed down through generations. The Telem lived along the escarpment many centuries ago, constructing small mud brick houses directly into the cliff face. Their buildings were carefully fitted into natural cavities and ledges within the rock, creating settlements suspended high above the ground. The location of these homes may seem strange at first. Why build houses so high above the valley floor? But the cliffs offered important advantages. From the elevated ledges, the inhabitants could watch the surrounding landscape for great distances. Any approaching visitors or potential threats would be visible long before reaching the settlement. The cliffs also provided protection from flooding during the seasonal rains that occasionally swept through the valleys below. And perhaps most importantly, the difficult access to the dwellings made them naturally defensive. Reaching the cliff homes required climbing steep rock faces using ropes or ladders. Not an easy journey for enemies. The architecture itself was simple but effective. The Telem built their structures using mud bricks shaped from local earth and reinforced with wooden beams. These materials allowed them to create small rectangular buildings that could be fitted securely into the rocky ledges. Many of these cliff structures served as homes, but others appear to have been used as granaries, places where food supplies could be safely stored away from animals and moisture. Archaeologists have also discovered burial chambers within the cliffs. The Telem often placed their dead high above the ground, possibly believing that the elevated position carried spiritual meaning or helped protect the remains from disturbance. Over time, the cliff dwellings became part of a complex landscape of human activity along the escarpment. Then, around the 15th century, a new community arrived. The Dogon people migrated into the region, likely seeking refuge from expanding empires and the spread of slavery across parts of West Africa. The towering cliffs of Bandiagara offered an ideal place for protection and isolation. When the Dogon settled along the escarpment, they encountered the remains of the earlier Telem structures already embedded in the cliffs. According to Dogon oral traditions, the Telem were described as small people who once lived high in the rocks and possessed mysterious abilities. Whether these stories reflect historical memory or symbolic myth is difficult to determine, but the presence of the ancient cliff dwellings certainly shaped the cultural landscape that the Dogon inherited. Unlike the Telem, the Dogon built most of their villages along the base of the escarpment and across the plateau above rather than directly within the cliffs. Their villages consist of mud brick houses, granaries with pointed thatched roofs, and ceremonial structures used for religious practices. Yet the cliff dwellings remained visible overhead, watching silently from the rock face. Some of these older structures were occasionally reused for storage or ritual purposes, but many were simply left untouched, preserved within the cliffs where they had stood for centuries. The relationship between the Dogon people and the escarpment goes far beyond architecture. The cliffs play an important role in Dogon spiritual beliefs and cosmology. Ritual ceremonies, masked dances, and traditional practices are closely connected to the surrounding landscape. Certain caves and rock formations are considered sacred. Paths along the escarpment lead to ceremonial sites used during important cultural events. In this way, the cliffs themselves became part of the cultural identity of the Dogon people. For modern archaeologists and historians, the Bandiagara escarpment offers a rare opportunity to study multiple layers of human history preserved within a single landscape. The cliff dwellings built by the Telem reveal how earlier communities adapted to the challenges of living in a harsh environment. The villages of the Dogon show how later societies continue to thrive in the same region while developing their own cultural traditions. Together, these layers create a living record of human resilience. Today, the Bandiagara escarpment is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, valued for both its archaeological importance and its continuing cultural traditions. Visitors traveling through the region can see the long sandstone cliffs rising above the land with ancient structures still visible in the rock face. From a distance, the cliff dwellings appear small, almost fragile against the massive wall of stone. Yet they have endured for centuries. Storms have passed across the desert. Empires have risen and fallen across West Africa. And still the small mud brick structures remain clinging to the cliffs. Quiet reminders of the people who once lived high above the valley floor. The Bandiagara escarpment is more than a natural formation. It is a landscape shaped by generations of human history, where architecture, survival, and culture have been woven together along the towering sandstone cliffs of Mali. The stone monoliths of Badrouhau Far out in the western Pacific Ocean, scattered across deep blue waters, lies the island nation of Palau. Today, the islands are known for their coral reefs, dense tropical forests, and quiet coastal villages. But hidden among the hills of Babeldub, the largest island of Palau, there are ancient stones that tell a much older story. High on a grassy ridge stands a mysterious site known as Badrulkau. At first glance, the place appears strangely simple. Rows of large stone monoliths stand upright in the earth, arranged in a long rectangular pattern across the hillside. Time and weather have worn their surfaces smooth, and many of them lean slightly after centuries of wind and rain. Yet even in their quiet state, the stones carry a sense of purpose. They were not placed here randomly. Someone brought them here. Someone arranged them carefully across the ridge. And the question that continues to intrigue historians and archaeologists is simple. Why? The site of Badrulkau is considered one of the largest prehistoric stone complexes in Micronesia. Dozens of upright basalt stones once stood here in organized rows, forming what appears to have been the foundation for an enormous traditional meeting structure. Local traditions describe the site as the remains of an ancient bai, a type of ceremonial men's house that played an important role in Palauan society. In traditional Palauan villages, the bai was far more than just a building. It served as the political and ceremonial center of the community. Important decisions were discussed there, rituals were performed, and leaders gathered to guide the affairs of the village. The bai represented authority, community, and tradition. At Badrulkau, the massive stone monoliths likely supported the wooden framework of such a structure. Each upright stone may have served the base for large wooden pillars that once held up a roof made from timber and thatch. If this interpretation is correct, the building that once stood here must have been enormous, much larger than the bai structures seen in most Palauan villages today. This suggests that Badrulkau may have served not just a single settlement, but possibly an entire regional community, a gathering place for leaders and clans across a wider area of Babeldub. The stones themselves were made from basalt, a volcanic rock common across the island. But even though the material was locally available, transporting these heavy blocks up the hillside would have required significant effort. Many of the monoliths weigh several tons. Moving them into position without modern tools would have required coordination and manpower, suggesting that the community responsible for building the site was both organized and capable of large-scale construction. Yet, unlike many ancient stone monuments found in other parts of the world, the stones of Badrulkau were never carved into elaborate shapes. They remain mostly natural, in form, rough pillars of dark stone rising from the ground. Their simplicity may have been intentional. In many Pacific Island cultures, the power of a monument does not necessarily come from decoration, but from its presence and connection to community traditions. Standing stones could represent stability, continuity, and the authority of ancestral customs. At Badrulkau, the alignment of the stones forms a long rectangular space that may once have been filled with wooden beams and a wide roof, creating a shaded gathering hall where leaders could meet and discuss matters affecting the surrounding region. Ceremonies may have taken place here, disputes resolved, plans made for the future of the community. Over time, however, the wooden parts of the structure disappeared. Tropical climates can be harsh on organic materials. Wood decays, thatch collapses, and roofs eventually fall away under years of heavy rain and sun. But the stone bases remained. Centuries passed. Vegetation slowly spread across the hillside, and the once impressive meeting house faded into memory. What remained were the monoliths, quiet rows of stone marking the outline of a building that once stood proudly on the ridge. Local oral traditions continued to remember the importance of Badrulkau. Stories passed down through generations described it as a powerful ceremonial site, connected to ancient leaders and early settlements on Babeldub. Although some details of those stories have changed over time, the memory of the place never completely disappeared. Modern archaeological research has helped confirm that the stones were indeed part of a large structural complex rather than random markers or burial monuments. Excavations around the site have revealed patterns in the placement of the monoliths that match the typical support systems used in traditional Bai architecture. The stones form the skeleton of a structure that once dominated the ridge. From that elevated position, the ancient meeting house would have overlooked large portions of the surrounding landscape. Visitors approaching the hill would have seen the building rising above the horizon, a clear symbol of community authority. Today, the site feels very different. Grass covers the ground where the wooden floors once stood. Birds move through the nearby trees, and the basalt pillars stand quietly beneath the open sky. Yet even in this quiet state, the arrangement of the stones still hints at the scale of what once existed here. Badro Chao remains one of the most intriguing archaeological sites in the Pacific, not because of towering temples or massive pyramids, but because of its simplicity. A gathering place built with stone foundations and wooden beams, a structure where people once met to shape the future of their communities. Now only the stones remain, standing patiently on the hillside of Babeldaub, silent witnesses to a chapter of Pacific Island history that continues to unfold through archaeology, tradition, and the enduring presence of those ancient monoliths. Dunadir Hill Fort. In the countryside of northeastern Scotland, where rolling green fields stretch across the Aberdeenshire landscape, a solitary hill rises quietly above the surrounding farmland. From a distance it appears unremarkable, just another natural rise among the gentle hills of the region. But as you move closer, the shape of the hill begins to stand out. At the summit lie the remains of an ancient stronghold. This place is known as Dunadir Hill Fort. Today the hill is calm and silent, often surrounded by grazing animals and winds moving across the open countryside. But thousands of years ago, the summit was once the center of a fortified settlement built high above the land. Hill forts like Dunadir appear across much of Britain and Ireland, often dating back to the Iron Age, a period that began roughly 2,500 years ago. During this time, communities across the region began constructing defensive settlements on elevated ground, using the natural landscape as a powerful form of protection. Dunadir was one of these strategic locations. The hill rises sharply from the surrounding fields, giving its summit a clear view across the nearby valleys and distant ridges. Anyone standing at the top can see movement across the countryside for miles in every direction. In an age before written maps or advanced communication, that visibility was extremely valuable. From this vantage point, the inhabitants of the hill fort could watch for approaching visitors, traders, or potential enemies. Control the hill, and you control the surrounding land. The earliest defensive structures at Dunadir likely consisted of earthen ramparts and wooden palisades built around the summit. These barriers would have formed a protective ring around the settlement, making it difficult for attackers to reach the interior. Archaeological evidence suggests that the hill fort may have been occupied by a local tribal community who used the elevated position as both a defensive refuge and a place of authority within the region. Inside the protective walls, life would have continued much like it did in other Iron Age settlements across Scotland. Roundhouses made from timber, stone, and thatch may have filled the interior space, forming a small community where families lived, worked, and shared resources. Fires burned inside the homes. Food was prepared from crops grown in nearby fields. Animals such as cattle and sheep grazed in the surrounding landscape. The hill fort served not only as a defensive site but also as a symbol of community identity. The people living here were connected by kinship, shared traditions, and the need to defend their land in an uncertain world. Over time, the settlement at Dunadir may have experienced periods of rebuilding and change. Defensive walls could have been strengthened or repaired as generations passed, adapting to new challenges or shifts in local power. Yet like many hill forts across Britain, Dunadir did not remain permanently occupied forever. As political structures changed and societies evolved, many hilltop settlements were gradually abandoned in favor of more accessible locations in the valleys below. But Dunadir's story did not end with the Iron Age. Centuries later, during the medieval period, the summit of the hill was chosen once again as the location for a new structure, a small stone tower house. The ruins of this tower can still be seen today. Built sometime around the 13th century, the tower represented a different type of defense suited to the medieval world. Instead of wooden palisades and earthen ramparts, thick stone walls formed a compact fortified residence where a local lord could oversee the surrounding land. The tower was never fully completed. For reasons that remain uncertain, construction appears to have stopped before the structure reached its intended height. The unfinished walls still stand today, rising above the hilltop like a reminder of an abandoned medieval ambition. Together, the Iron Age hill fort and the later tower tell a story of how the same landscape was used by different societies across centuries. Both communities recognize the value of Dunadir's elevated position. Both chose the hill as a place of defense and authority. Today, visitors climbing the path to the summit can see the traces of these different periods layered across the hill. The remains of ancient ramparts, the stone ruins of the medieval tower, and beyond them, the open Scottish countryside stretching far into the distance. The wind moves freely across the summit. Clouds drift slowly overhead. It is easy to imagine how the view would have appeared to the people who once lived here. Warriors watching the horizon for signs of movement. Farmers returning from fields below. Messengers arriving along distant paths. For thousands of years, Dunadir Hill Fort stood as a place where people sought security, leadership, and connection to the land around them. Even though the settlement eventually faded and the tower was left unfinished, the hill itself remains, rising quietly above the fields, holding the memory of the communities that once gathered on its summit. Today, Dunadir Hill Fort is no longer a place of defense or power, but its stones and earthworks still preserve the story of a hill that watched centuries of Scottish history unfold beneath the wide northern sky. The Cercado Passage Grave. On the western coast of France, in the historic region of Brittany, the landscape is filled with reminders of an incredibly distant past. Scattered across fields, forests, and quiet coastal plains are some of the oldest stone monuments in Europe, mysterious structures built thousands of years before written history. Among these ancient sites lies a remarkable monument known as the Cercado Passage Grave. At first glance, the structure appears modest. A rounded mound rises gently from the ground, covered with grass and surrounded by trees. In the center stands a tall standing stone, pointing upward toward the sky like a silent marker from another age. But beneath the mound lies something far older and far more mysterious. A stone-built burial chamber, and a narrow passage leading deep into the center of the monument. The Cercado Passage Grave is believed to date back to around 4600 BCE, making it more than 6,000 years old. This places it firmly within the Neolithic period, a time when early farming communities were spreading across Europe and beginning to build some of the continent's earliest monumental structures. The builders of Cercado did not leave behind written records. We do not know their names or their languages. But the monument they constructed reveals a great deal about their beliefs and their understanding of the world around them. The structure itself follows a design seen in many Neolithic tombs across Western Europe. A long stone corridor, the passage, leads into a circular burial chamber built from large slabs of stone. These slabs form the walls and roof of the chamber, creating a space that would have been used to place the remains of the dead. The entire structure was then covered with a mound of earth and stones, forming the rounded hill that is still visible today. This type of monument is known as a passage grave, and its design may have carried symbolic meaning. The long passage leading into the chamber has often been interpreted as representing a journey from the world of the living into the realm of the ancestors. Walking through the narrow corridor toward the chamber would have felt like entering another world, a place of memory, a place of reverence. Inside the chamber, Archaeologists have discovered traces of human burials along with fragments of pottery and other objects that may have been placed as offerings. These items suggest that the tomb was used repeatedly over long periods of time, serving as a communal burial place for members of the surrounding community. Rather than individual graves scattered across the landscape, the people who built Cercado created a single monument where generations could be laid to rest together. The mound itself was carefully constructed. Large stones were used to support the internal chamber and passage. While layers of earth and smaller rocks formed the outer covering, this construction helped protect the interior space while also creating a visible landmark across the surrounding terrain. And the tall standing stone placed on top of the mound adds another layer of mystery. Standing stones appear throughout the prehistoric landscapes of Brittany, often connected to ceremonial or astronomical traditions. At Cercado, the stone may have served as a marker indicating the sacred importance of the burial mound, or perhaps it held deeper symbolic meaning. Some researchers believe monuments like this may have been aligned with specific solar events, such as sunrise during certain times of the year. Although the exact alignment of Cercado remains debated, many passage graves across Europe are known to have been constructed with remarkable attention to the movement of the sun. If the builders of Cercado followed similar traditions, the passage may have allowed sunlight to enter the chamber at specific moments during the year, illuminating the burial space briefly before darkness returned. A powerful symbolic connection between the cycles of nature and the memory of the dead. The landscape surrounding Cercado contains many other prehistoric monuments as well. Brittany is home to one of the densest concentrations of Neolithic structures in Europe, including standing stones, burial mounds, and ceremonial alignments. This suggests that the region held great cultural importance for the communities living here thousands of years ago. The people who built Cercado were not isolated farmers working alone. They were part of a larger network of Neolithic societies that shared ideas, traditions, and architectural knowledge across vast areas of Western Europe. Building a passage grave required planning, cooperation, and a strong understanding of stone construction. Large slabs had to be transported from nearby sources and carefully positioned to form a stable chamber capable of supporting the weight of the mound above. Without metal tools or modern machinery, this work demanded significant effort from the entire community. Yet the builders clearly believed the monument was worth that effort. For them, the passage grave was more than a burial place. It was a connection between generations, a structure where the living could remember the dead and reaffirm their relationship with the land. Over thousands of years, the mound has endured storms, changing climates, and the gradual transformation of the surrounding landscape. Empires rose and fell across Europe. New cultures replaced old ones. But the Cercado Passage grave remained, quietly preserving the memory of the people who built it. Today, visitors can still approach the mound and walk along the narrow passage into the ancient chamber. Inside, the air is cool and still. Stone walls surround the small interior space. And for a moment, it becomes easier to imagine the world as it might have been 6,000 years ago. A community gathering around the newly built monument. Rituals performed at the entrance. Torches lighting the passage as the chamber welcomed the remains of another member of the village. The Cercado Passage grave stands today not only as an archaeological site but also as a reminder of humanity's deep history. A simple mound of earth and stone, yet one of the oldest surviving monuments to memory, belief, and the enduring connection between people and the landscapes they call home. Castro de Coaña. Along the rugged northern coast of Spain, in the region of Asturias, a hill rises quietly above the surrounding valleys not far from the Cantabrian Sea. Today the landscape is peaceful, covered with green fields and forests shaped by Atlantic winds. But on the summit of this hill lies one of the most remarkable archaeological sites of ancient Iberia. This place is known as Castro de Coaña. At first glance, the ruins appear modest, low stone walls scattered across the hillside. Yet these remains once formed a carefully organized settlement belonging to the Castro culture. a network of fortified communities that flourished across northwestern Spain and Portugal during the late Bronze Age and Iron Age. The word castro itself refers to a fortified hilltop settlement, and Coaña is one of the best preserved examples ever discovered. Archaeologists believe the settlement was first established around the 4th century BCE, during a time when tribal communities across the Iberian Peninsula were developing stronger defensive structures and more permanent villages. The location chosen for Castro de Coaña was not accidental. The hill offers a natural defensive advantage. Steep slopes protect several sides of the settlement, while the surrounding valleys provide fertile land for farming and grazing animals. From the top of the hill, inhabitants could watch the landscape below and detect movement from a great distance. In an age when rival groups competed for territory and resources, such visibility was invaluable. But the people who built Castro de Coaña did not rely on geography alone. They constructed powerful defenses. Thick stone walls surrounded the settlement, creating a fortified perimeter that protected the community inside. In some sections, multiple defensive barriers were built, forcing any potential attacker to pass through narrow entrances that could easily be controlled by defenders. Inside the walls, the settlement reveals an organized layout that reflects both practical planning and cultural tradition. One of the most distinctive features of the site is the shape of its houses. Many of the homes were built as circular stone structures, with thick walls and thatched roofs supported by wooden beams. These round houses were typical of the Castro culture and appear across many similar settlements throughout the region. Inside each structure, daily life unfolded within a compact but functional space. The floors were often made of packed earth or stone. Small hearths provided warmth and a place to cook food, while storage areas held supplies of grain, tools, and household objects. Families lived close together inside the fortified walls, forming a tight-knit community where cooperation was essential for survival. Narrow stone pathways connected the houses, winding between buildings as they followed the natural slope of the hill. At the center of the settlement stood one of its most unusual structures, a rectangular building often referred to as the sauna or ritual bath. This building is one of the most distinctive features of several Castro sites in northern Iberia. Archaeologists believe it may have been used for ritual purification ceremonies involving heated stones and steam. The structure includes a small entrance corridor, a central chamber, and evidence of a heating system that would have generated intense heat inside the building. Although the exact purpose of these ritual baths is still debated, many researchers believe they were connected to spiritual or communal practices rather than simple hygiene. The presence of such a structure suggests that life in Castro de Coaña was not only about defense and survival. It also involved ceremony, belief, and shared cultural traditions. Over time, the settlement continued to develop and expand. Additional houses were constructed, walls were reinforced, and the community grew into an important center within the surrounding region. Trade networks connected the inhabitants to other settlements across northern Iberia. Goods, such as metals, pottery, and agricultural products, likely moved between communities along routes that followed the valleys and coastal plains. Eventually, the region came into contact with one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, the Roman Empire. During the late 1st century BCE, Roman forces began expanding into northern Spain, bringing new systems of governance, trade, and culture into the region. Many indigenous communities, including those living in Castro settlements, were gradually integrated into the Roman world. At Castro de Coaña, archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement continued to exist during the early Roman period. Roman materials such as pottery and coins have been discovered at the site, indicating that the inhabitants maintained connections with the new political and economic systems introduced by Roman rule. Yet even as Roman influence spread across the region, many aspects of the traditional Castro culture remained visible. The circular houses continued to be used. The settlement layout remained largely intact. Life here evolved slowly rather than changing overnight. Eventually, however, the settlement was abandoned. The reasons remain uncertain. Like many ancient communities, Castro de Cabaña likely experienced shifts in population, trade routes, and political organization that gradually reduced its importance. Over time, the houses fell into ruin. Roofs collapsed. Stone walls slowly weathered under centuries of rain and wind. Vegetation grew across the hillside, covering the remains of the once thriving settlement. For many centuries, the ruins remained largely forgotten. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists began systematic excavations at the site, uncovering the layout of the ancient settlement and revealing the remarkable preservation of its structures. Today, Castro de Cabaña is considered one of the most important archaeological sites for understanding the Castro culture of northern Iberia. Visitors walking through the site can still see the circular stone houses arranged across the hillside, connected by narrow paths and surrounded by defensive walls that once protected the community. Standing among these ruins, it becomes easier to imagine what the settlement may have looked like more than 2,000 years ago. Smoke rising from the hearths of round houses, children moving through the stone pathways, farmers returning from the fields below the hill. The people who built Castro de Cabaña left behind no written history. Yet the settlement they constructed still tells their story. A story of community, adaptation, and life on a fortified hill overlooking the green landscapes of northern Spain. The stone citadel of Hasanlu. In the northwestern corner of Iran, not far from the southern shores of Lake Urmia, there rises a large archaeological mound known as Hasanlu. Today the mound appears quiet and unassuming, surrounded by farmland and distant mountains. But beneath its layers of soil lies the remains of a city that once stood at the crossroads of powerful, ancient civilizations. For centuries, communities lived and rebuilt upon this same hill, leaving behind layer after layer of structures, artifacts, and memories buried within the earth. Each layer represents a different chapter of the settlement's long history. Among these layers is one of the most dramatic discoveries ever made in Near Eastern archaeology: the remains of a stone citadel, once standing at the heart of the ancient city. Hasanlu was strategically positioned along important routes connecting Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and the highlands of Anatolia. Because of this location, the city became part of a network of trade and cultural exchange that linked different regions of the ancient world. Merchants passed through its streets, goods traveled along its roads, and ideas moved between distant cultures. Over time, the settlement grew into a fortified center where political authority and economic activity were concentrated. At the center of the city stood the citadel, a raised fortified area that functioned as the administrative and ceremonial core of Hasanlu. Built using thick stone walls and reinforced structures, the citadel overlooked the surrounding settlement from an elevated position. This elevation served both practical and symbolic purposes. From the citadel, leaders could watch the surrounding countryside and monitor activity in the city below. At the same time, the elevated structure visibly reinforced the authority of those who controlled it. The citadel was not only a fortress, it was the heart of the city. Within its walls stood large buildings constructed from stone foundations and mud brick walls. These structures likely served as administrative halls, storage areas, and residences for the ruling elite. Some buildings contained large courtyards where officials and visitors may have gathered. Others held storerooms filled with goods collected from surrounding regions. These goods may have included grain, textiles, metal objects, and valuable materials obtained through trade. The architecture of the citadel reflects careful planning. Thick defensive walls surrounded the complex, creating a protected space where important activities could take place safely within the city's core. Narrow entrances controlled movement into the citadel, allowing guards to monitor who entered and left the area. Beyond the citadel walls lay the rest of the city. Residential neighborhoods spread outward across the mound, filled with smaller houses where ordinary citizens lived their daily lives. Craftspeople worked with metal, pottery, and other materials, producing goods that supported both the local population and regional trade networks. For many generations, Hasanlu prospered, but one particular layer of the site reveals a moment of sudden and violent destruction. Around 800 BCE, the city appears to have been attacked. Archaeological evidence suggests that a powerful invading force overwhelmed the settlement, setting buildings on fire and causing the collapse of many structures within the citadel. The destruction was so sudden that many inhabitants were unable to escape. When archaeologists excavated the burned remains of the citadel, they discovered the bodies of individuals who had been trapped inside collapsing buildings. These discoveries provide a haunting glimpse into the final moments of the city during that catastrophic event. One of the most famous artifacts discovered at Hasanlu also comes from this destruction layer. During excavations in the 1950s, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable object now known as the Hasanlu Golden Bowl. The bowl was found clutched in the arms of a man who appears to have been attempting to carry it away during the attack. Before he could escape, the building collapsed around him, preserving both the artifact and the moment in time. The golden bowl itself is beautifully decorated with scenes of mythological figures and ceremonial imagery, offering valuable insight into the artistic traditions and religious beliefs of the culture that once thrived at Hasanlu. Its discovery remains one of the most dramatic moments in archaeological history. The destruction of the city marked the end of one of Hasanlu's most prosperous phases. Although the site continued to be occupied at later times, it never fully regained the same level of importance it once held. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell across the region. Yet the burned remains of the citadel remained buried beneath the mound, preserving a snapshot of life at the moment the city fell. Moderns. Excavations have revealed not only the layout of the citadel, but also the remarkable preservation of artifacts and structures trapped within the destruction layer. Because the fire and collapsed walls sealed many objects in place, archaeologists were able to study the site in extraordinary detail. They could see how rooms were arranged, where tools and storage jars were kept, and even where individuals had been standing when the buildings collapsed. Today, Hasanlu remains one of the most important archaeological sites for understanding the complex cultures that once inhabited the highlands of northwestern Iran. The stone citadel, though now reduced to foundations and fragments, still marks the place where authority, trade, and daily life once converged. Visitors walking across the mound today see only quiet earth and scattered ruins. But beneath those stones lies the story of a city that once stood at the center of a vibrant and interconnected ancient world, and at the heart of that city stood the citadel, a stronghold of stone that witnessed both the prosperity and the sudden fall of Hasanlu more than 2,000 years ago. The Skorba Temples. On the northern coast of the Mediterranean island of Malta, surrounded by dry fields and quiet rural land, lies a modest archaeological site known as Skorba. At first glance, the ruins seem simple compared to the grand stone temples found elsewhere on the island. Low walls, scattered stones, and the outline of ancient structures rest quietly beneath the Maltese sun. Yet, despite its modest appearance, Skorba holds a very important place in the story of early European civilization. Beneath these stones lies evidence of some of the oldest monumental architecture in the Mediterranean. The Skorba temples date back more than 5,000 years, to a time long before the pyramids of Egypt or the great cities of classical Greece. During this distant period, prehistoric communities on the islands of Malta and Gozo were developing one of the most unique temple-building cultures in the ancient world. These people left behind massive stone complexes that still puzzle archaeologists today. Skorba represents one of the earliest chapters of that tradition. Excavations at the site have revealed that the area was already occupied by farming communities around 5,200 BCE. These early settlers lived in simple huts made from stone and organic materials, forming a small village on the gently sloping hillside. They cultivated crops, raised animals, and built a stable community that gradually expanded over time. What makes Skorba especially significant is the discovery of several important cultural layers within the site. Archaeologists studying the remains uncovered pottery and artifacts belonging to different prehistoric phases of Maltese culture. Two of these cultural periods, known as the Gar Dalam phase and the Skorba phase, were first clearly identified through discoveries made here. This means the site helped researchers understand how the earliest Maltese societies developed and changed across centuries. Eventually, the inhabitants of Skorba began building something far more ambitious than simple village houses. They started constructing stone temples. These temples were built using large blocks of limestone gathered from nearby quarries. The builders carefully positioned the stones to form thick walls that enclosed a series of internal chambers. Like many of Malta's prehistoric temples, the Skorba structures followed a distinctive architectural layout. Curved walls created rounded rooms known as apses, which opened into a central corridor. This design produced a clover-shaped arrangement of chambers inside the temple. The precise purpose of these spaces remains uncertain. However, many archaeologists believe they were used for ritual activities connected to religion or community gatherings. Within the temple complex, researchers discovered small altars, decorative stone features, and traces of fire that may have been part of ceremonial practices. One particularly intriguing discovery at Skorba was the remains of plastered floors and red-painted walls, suggesting that the temple interiors were once far more colorful and elaborate than the bare stone ruins visible today. These details hint at a sacred environment carefully designed to create a powerful atmosphere during rituals. The people who built Skorba belonged to a culture that clearly invested enormous effort into constructing these ceremonial spaces. Moving and positioning the heavy stone blocks would have required cooperation between many members of the community. Without metal tools or modern equipment, the builders relied on stone tools, wooden levers, and collective labor to shape the temple structures. Yet the effort was repeated again and again across the Maltese islands. Dozens of similar temples were eventually constructed at sites such as Hagar Kim, Manadra, and Tarxian. Together, these structures form one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric religious architecture anywhere in the world. Skorba represents one of the earliest examples in this remarkable tradition. Over time, the temple complex was modified and expanded. New rooms were added, walls were reinforced, and the surrounding settlement continued to evolve alongside the sacred structures. For many generations, Skorba likely served as both a village and a ceremonial center where the community gathered for important events. But eventually, the temple building culture of Malta disappeared. Around 2500 BCE, many of the great temple complexes across the islands were abandoned. Archaeologists still debate the reasons behind this sudden decline. Some theories suggest environmental pressures such as drought or soil exhaustion may have made farming more difficult. Others point to social changes or the arrival of new populations that altered the cultural landscape of the islands. Whatever the cause, the temples were gradually left behind, roofs collapsed, walls eroded, and centuries of weather slowly transformed the once vibrant sacred spaces into quiet ruins. For thousands of years, the stones remained largely undisturbed. It was not until the 20th century that systematic excavations revealed the importance of Skorba in understanding the earliest phases of Maltese prehistory. Today, the site is recognized as part of the UNESCO World Heritage Group of Maltese Megalithic Temples, a collection of monuments considered among the oldest freestanding structures built by humans. Visitors walking through Skorba today see only fragments of the ancient temples. Low stone walls mark the outlines of rooms. Pieces of pottery and artifacts discovered during excavations are now preserved in museums. Yet even in this quiet state, the site continues to reveal important clues about the people who lived here thousands of years ago. The farmers who first settled the hillside, the builders who raised the stone temples, and the communities who gathered within those chambers to perform rituals whose meanings are now lost to time. Skorba may not be the largest temple complex on Malta, but it represents one of the earliest steps in the remarkable story of a civilization that left behind some of the world's oldest monumental stone architecture. A story written not in words, but in stone. The Stone Fort of Rathgall. In the green countryside of County Wicklow, Ireland, where rolling hills stretch across the landscape and the ancient fields meet the edges of quiet forests, there stands a hill that once held one of the most remarkable prehistoric settlements in Ireland. This place is known as Rathgall. From a distance, the hill appears peaceful and almost ordinary. But when archaeologists first began studying the summit, they discovered that the hill had once been surrounded by a massive system of stone defenses. These defenses formed what is now called the Rathgall Stone Fort. The structure dates back to the Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest fortified hilltop settlements discovered in Ireland. During this time, communities across the island were developing new ways of organizing their societies, expanding agriculture, and building settlements that could protect their people and resources. The builders of Rathgall chose their location carefully. The hill rises above the surrounding farmland, providing a wide view across the valleys of Wicklow. From the summit, inhabitants could observe the landscape for miles in every direction. In an age where communication was limited and communities were often separated by long distances, such visibility offered a significant advantage. Anyone approaching the hill would have been noticed long before reaching the settlement. But the natural elevation was only part of the defense. The inhabitants constructed an impressive series of concentric stone walls around the summit. These walls formed multiple defensive rings that surrounded the central area of the settlement. The outer walls were built using large stones gathered from the surrounding landscape. Carefully stacked without mortar, the stones created thick barriers that would have made it extremely difficult for attackers to enter the hilltop enclosure. Inside these defensive rings, archaeologists discovered the remains of numerous structures. Evidence suggests that the interior of Rathgall once contained several houses, storage areas, and working spaces where the inhabitants carried out their daily activities. The houses were likely built using a combination of stone foundations and wooden walls with thatched roofs. Within these homes, families would have cooked meals, crafted tools, and shared daily life within the protective enclosure of the hill fort. The settlement appears to have been carefully organized. Stone pathways connected different parts of the hilltop, while the defensive walls created clear boundaries between the interior living spaces and the surrounding countryside. Rathgall was not simply a defensive refuge used during times of conflict. It was a functioning community. Archaeological excavations have revealed that the inhabitants of Rathgall were skilled metal workers, particularly in the production of bronze tools and weapons. Evidence of metalworking activities suggests that the settlement may have served as an important center for craft production during the Bronze Age. This would have made Rathgall valuable not only as a place of residence, but also as a regional hub where materials and finished goods were produced and exchanged. Bronze objects discovered at the site include tools, weapons, and decorative items that demonstrate the advanced metalworking skills of the community. These discoveries indicate that the people living at Rathgall were connected to wider trade networks that spread across Ireland and beyond. Raw materials such as copper and tin were essential for producing bronze, and these metals often had to be transported over long distances. The hilltop settlement may therefore have played a role in the distribution of metal goods throughout the region. Over time, the settlement likely grew in importance. The multiple defensive walls suggest that the community invested significant effort in protecting the site. Each ring of stone added another layer of security, creating a fortified environment where valuable resources and skilled craftspeople could operate safely. Life on the hilltop would have been closely connected to the surrounding landscape. Farmers cultivated crops in the valleys below. Livestock grazed in nearby fields. And members of the community likely moved regularly between the hill fort and the farmland that supported their survival. Yet, like many ancient settlements, Rathgall eventually experienced decline. The reasons are not fully understood. Changes in social organization, shifts in trade networks, Our environmental pressures may have contributed to the gradual abandonment of the hilltop community. As generations passed and people moved elsewhere, the houses collapsed and the hill returned to a quieter state. The stone walls remained. Over centuries, vegetation spread across the ruins, and the defensive rings slowly blended into the natural contours of the hillside. For a long time, the site attracted little attention beyond local curiosity. It was not until modern archaeological excavations began that the true importance of Rathgall became clear. Researchers studying the site uncovered evidence of the extensive stone fortifications and the remains of the Bronze Age settlement that once stood within them. Today, Rathgall is recognized as one of Ireland's most significant prehistoric hill forts. Visitors walking across the hill can still see the outlines of the ancient walls forming wide circles around the summit. The stones lie quietly in the grass, marking the boundaries of a settlement that once held homes, workshops, and the daily life of a thriving Bronze Age community. Standing on the hilltop today, it is easy to imagine the view as it must have appeared thousands of years ago. Smoke rising from thatched houses, craftspeople working with bronze inside the fortified walls, and watchful eyes scanning the distant valleys below. The stone fort of Rathgall may now be silent, but the walls still remain, encircling the hill as they have for thousands of years, preserving the memory of one of Ireland's earliest fortified communities.